Actually, a great example of this today of how the concern with preservation can end up being so useful is some of your listeners may or may not be aware there's a big prize right now to read scrolls that were dug up in the 18th century from the volcanic blast at Vesuvius. So I think it's the 1720s. A shepherd discovers walking around Herculaneum, near Pompeii, the famous Pompeii, that he discovers basically a bunch of scrolls. They try to open them very carefully in the 18th century, but I think the first two or three scrolls they just crumble to dust. They're just way too fragile. And so after that, they just preserved all of them. They tried not to touch them at all. And only now, with advances in AI, with advances in particle physics, with advances in all of the technology associated with those things, those can be read, right? So they can digitally unfurl the scrolls without actually having to. They can scan the thing without actually having to break them open. So the preservation there will end up presumably giving us quite a lot of detail once we can read what's inside them.
Today's episode is proudly brought to you by Effortless. Effortless is the ultimate solution for startups and SMBs seeking seamless money management and compliance handling, e-invoicing and e-way bill generation with just a couple of clicks, slashing collection efforts by a staggering 90% through the magic of automated follow-ups, snapping a quick photo of your bill to instantly log expenses. With Effortless, you get the power of a consolidated bank account view, seeing both business and personal accounts seamlessly integrated. With Effortless, making UPI-like payments is a breeze. Effortless keeps you on track, ensuring your finances and compliance are always in top shape. Effortless wasn't just created by anyone. It was crafted by chartered accountants and entrepreneurs who understand the pulse of startups and SMBs. Visit www.goeffortless.ai and embark on a journey that will redefine the way you do business. Effortless, because managing a business should be anything but a hassle. Hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of ContraMinds. In this episode, I am talking to Anton Howes. Anton Howes is the head of innovation research at the UK-based think tank, the Entrepreneurs Network, which encourages innovation and entrepreneurship. He is also the historian in residence at the Royal Society of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce. I spoke to Anton about how the Royal Society of Arts encouraged innovation and invention in the late 17th and 18th century. We also spoke about how innovation spread during that time, which led to the Industrial Revolution. We also spoke about the importance of interdisciplinary learning that stimulates innovation. We also had an interesting conversation on how the center of gravity of innovation and invention moved from Britain to the US in the early 19th century, and where does he think the center of gravity for innovation and invention will move over the next decade or two. Over to my conversation with Anton. Hi Anton, it's lovely talking to you. I'm really super excited to speak to you. I'm a follower of your newsletter, your books, the work that you do, and I'm indeed privileged to have you as a special guest in the ContraMinds podcast.
Lovely. Thanks very much for having me.
So Anton, I just wanted to start off our conversation on the work that you do on inventions, right? You pretty much track it back to the 17th century. And you specifically talk about the fact that the 18th century was the age of improvement, right? So why do you consider 18th century as the age of improvement?
It's a period in which, across all facets of human endeavor, so in making textiles, in agriculture, in ceramics, in gardening, in the usage of different energy sources in mining, in minerals. I mean, absolutely anything, you name it, there is an appreciable increase in the rate of invention. And I think it's one of those things that's often lost on a lot of people. Like when people think of the Industrial Revolution or they think of the 18th century, they think of a few maybe big inventions, and that stands out in their mind. And they say, okay, yeah, there's a bunch of inventions, and some of those are important, some of those not so much. What I think is often lost is just how much activity is going on in order to produce a few of those inventions, but also all of the stuff in the background that's happening. So improvements in tool making, in machines, and across all of the different industries in which it takes place as well. So, most people aren't going to be able to name very many medical innovations of the 18th century, perhaps beyond something like vaccination or inoculation. But there's a great deal of activity that's taking place. Likewise for ceramics or for gardening, these are not things that really spring to people's minds, but there's so much that's happening. And it's hundreds of people doing very small marginal improvements. So it's not necessarily, I like to call it an age of improvement rather than invention, although my Substack's name is called the Age of Invention. It's kind of just a title off the cuff, It's really an age of improvement because it's like having hundreds or thousands of people improving the thing that they do or something else that they've seen by about 5%. It's not like big leaps forward. It's not, we're suddenly going to the moon or something, just from standing still, but rather that things are getting faster and faster and faster. They're getting more efficient. They're getting more beautiful. Food is getting tastier. Food is getting more abundant. I mean, all of these different things are happening in a way that's often very difficult, even today, for us to appreciate, right? Even today, this happens where, we get used to the latest patch on our, software. That kind of improvement doesn't win awards. It doesn't get lots of people interested, but it's the kind of thing upon which the modern world is made. And it's in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries that you start to see that, right? Before then, it's really not obvious that there's very much going on.
Okay. So you're talking about, incremental improvements happening. And do you see some kind of in your study, say, for example, you talk about the 16th century, but the impact on how it hits the society takes, several, maybe a decade or a century, so to speak. So therefore, have you kind of studied that and looked at an invention to really make a significant impact in the way it changes the society and culture? How long do you believe it takes? Because you tend to look at the end most of the times and get excited, but when you study history, you realize that it probably is almost maybe done about 100 years back. And is that some kind of a history or statistic that you kind of picked up?
Yeah, I don't think there's a general rule for particular inventions, right? It's not like it's always going to be 100 years or 120 years or 80 years, and that maybe changes over time. Certainly, there are changes in the speed of adoption of inventions, right? I mean, a lot of people will have seen curves for showing the number of people in the proportion of people in the United States, for example, who owned a television or refrigerator or car or iPhone, and it gets steeper and steeper and steeper the further you get into the 20th and then into the 21st century. So yeah, it's unclear with adoption. I suspect it was much slower. Things like the printing press do make a huge difference in terms of just speeding up adoption rates, because your ability to put out information for people to be able to figure out what's going on increases quite appreciably. So communications technology is a big part of that, and presumably will have changed that rate. But also, not all things need to be adopted by everyone, right? A lot of the inventions we're talking about are only done by a handful of manufacturers, a handful of artisans, and they're often covering the entire country pretty much, or entire cities. And there are, I think, some big some impactful inventions, many of which will be almost unknown today, where just from the way that the economy is structured at the time, they have much larger and much more rapid impacts than others. So to give you an example, today, if you were to come up with an invention in Britain that improved agriculture by 100%, so a doubling in the efficiency of agriculture in Britain. Agriculture only accounts for what, 1-2% of the British economy today. So even your doubling is not going to have a huge impact on most day-to-day people's lives in the country. If, however, you come up with 100% improvement in agriculture in 1600, when agriculture accounts for the majority of employment, the majority of people's expenditure in terms of family, household expenditure, about 80% of people's wages at least is going on food and drink, on output in general as well within the economy. It'll again be about 50-60% still. You're going to have a huge impact on basically everyone's lives, to the extent that even small changes in agriculture, the 1% and 0.5% and 0.2% improvement, many of which we probably don't know much about at all and really deserve quite a lot of study, are not going to seem as though there's much going on, but actually you could have very dramatic, very quick changes happening as well. Right? You improve the efficiency of agriculture back then, and everyone's going to notice, even if they don't know what's responsible, they're going to see results, right? They're going to see more people. They're going to see better food. They're really going to notice, considering just how much more of their daily experience is just revolving around that one sector of the economy. The same with textiles, right? There's a reason everyone talks about cotton all the time when it comes to the Industrial Revolution. It's because textiles were a really, really big deal, right? Clothing yourself was much more expensive as a proportion of your income as it would be today. Clothing, textiles accounts for something like about 15% of the economy in Britain, in the 18th century.
Okay.
That's a big deal, right? Even in China today, where so many of the world's textiles are coming from, I don't think it's ever been more. Well, around now, it's not more than 7 or 8%, right? So even then, it's double the size in terms of just internally what's going on. So yeah, those inventions have a much bigger impact, and it's no surprise that people notice at the time, and that's the reason those inventions are the famous ones. Whereas you can have just as much invention happening in, I don't know, I keep mentioning gardening because it's just a nice example of something where not that many people are doing gardening, right? But even though there's not that many people doing gardening, right, you can see very similar amounts of improvement taking place, but they're not having this much broader impact on everyone's lives.
Mm-hmm. So, from whatever I've been reading about your work, one thing that keeps coming back, which I kind of keep noting down, is this whole thing around the importance of interdisciplinary thinking, which fuels innovation. How important is that?
I think that's a really good question in a sense. In a sense, I don't think it's important because in a sense, I think it's the wrong way to think about it in a way. It's not that we should be going out in our day-to-day lives, I think, and just saying, how can I apply this discipline to this discipline, or trying to be interdisciplinary. The way I think of it is that a lot of inventors or improvers, innovators in a general sense, they're applying improvement to whatever they see. And it's not so much that they're necessarily taking the skills of one sector and applying it to another sector. I don't think anyone some people do, but I don't think that's the general thing that's taking place. I think it's more that they might improve some sector and then they just think, I don't know, a friend of theirs works in another industry and they say, have you tried doing XYZ? It works for us too. Or they find out a little bit about it and say, that seems really inefficient. Why are you doing it that way? Like, I'm so used to doing it this other way. Or I can immediately see just as an outsider that the way things done may not be the right way, or the best way that things can be done. So I think, that kind of optimization is almost in a sense independent of disciplines. So in a way, yes, the outcome is that you end up with a lot of interdisciplinary action, but I don't think that's necessarily the intention going into it, right? That's just more how it seems to occur after the fact.
Okay. The reason I'm saying that is, when I look at how mechanics, art, photography, were all kind of there were premiums being paid by the the Royal Society of Arts, and then you had a whole host of I would say inspiration being built out of such disciplines, and then it gets probably applied in, say, machines or in other forms of inventions. That's the reason I was asking that question.
No, I think there's definitely something to it in the sense that you definitely see spillovers or people coming at different disciplines with different backgrounds in mind, where they're just used to the way things are done and can't. To them, it's almost like ridiculous that people will be doing it the way they're doing it instead of the way that seems so obvious, right? It's almost like an
Perfect.
outsider's advantage, I guess.
Okay. And what do you think was the influence of Francis Bacon in you know uh, almost acting as a catalyst for this kind of thinking to start very early? You kind of trace it back to the 16th, 17th century, and so what was his influence like, and what impact that did it have on the future generations?
Yeah, I think Francis Bacon's a pretty big deal. Not as an inventor himself, but certainly as someone who, almost like as a visionary, right? Someone who outlines a vision of this is the kind of society we could have if we make ingenuity, improvement, invention a big part of how we should be doing things. And I think that captures a lot of people's imaginations. So you definitely had loads of improvers and inventors before he comes around or he starts writing. But when he puts out, some of his works, people start to think that's a pretty cool. It's almost like it's like a movement defining kind of works, right? So
Hmm.
like nowadays, you often see manifestos from tech people, which are often highly influential, and people kind of gather around those things. And it's not like they're the first inventors, but those manifestos sometimes have a kind of, as you say, you say a catalyzing effect. It's almost a kind of augmenting effect by sort of building up people's self-identities around it, right? So I guess before you could have been, I don't know, improving woodworking or something. But the moment you read, and then you read Francis Bacon, you're like, oh, I'm not just improving woodworking. I'm an inventor. I'm an improver in this more general sense. I'm part of this big project that's actually a bit broader. And that maybe gets you thinking, seeing the bigger picture, which in itself is also quite inspiring, right? And kind of leads you to other projects beyond the ones that you're already involved with.
Okay. And what kind of movement can you kind of talk to our audience on? What kind of movement did it, drive when he started talking about the work that he was doing?
I mean, part of the project from Bacon's perspective is around science. So it's
Hmm.
about building up a lot. Well, it's two things. One is skepticism of things that have already been done. So going back and checking all the work that were done during the medieval period by the ancients, double checking if all of the stuff that's already written down has already been published is actually true. And then the second part of it is once we've established that, or while that's going on, let's also go out and systematically collect things, catalog things, systematize the collection of knowledge, and kind of see knowledge creation as being part of this. I mean, he even compares it to a kind of like an assault on nature, right? And not in the sense of like putting nature under humans' feet, but rather trying to prise open all of the secrets that nature has. So he compares it to the tiny army that Cortez conquered the Aztec Empire with. He says you need to have this core group of people who are going out there and they're trying to figure out all of what's going on in nature. And from that, you can start to derive useful knowledge. You can start to derive physical laws about the way physics works, about the way mechanics works. You can start to find all of the plants that could be used in medicines, all of the minerals that could be used in medicines or for dyes or for chemicals. Right? Once you've once you've catalogued all that kind of information, you can start to apply it and use it. And that's the other part of the vision that is so inspiring to people, is they think, okay, this isn't just about, I don't know, collecting insects because we like insects. It's about collecting lots and lots of insects because who knows, we might discover some use for this information. And being part of that broader project means that we can better the lot of humankind.
Okay. So it's almost like, looking at connecting the unconnected, and there could be inspiration coming from various sources, but collecting information and keeping it so that it's almost like the indexing of a database, right? You do not know
Yeah.
when the idea is going to come, but as you collect more information, the chances of innovation and invention happening is something that he kind of practiced and preached, is what you're saying.
Yeah, he certainly practices that. Like, some of his works are very much about just kind of listing all of the things we know, all of the experiments the things we don't quite know, and we should do some experiments on these things. Right? Experiment, right? It's about experience, like just trying something out for oneself and seeing it with one's own eyes, and testing that against what we've read in other books, right, from other older authors. So he's worried about the corruption of the older stuff we already seem to know, and whether or not we really do know those things, so kind of firming up that base, as well as moving on to new information. And the other thing I mentioned, which is often missed, I think, in a lot of discussions of Bacon, is a lot of it's also about preservation. So you mentioned databases. Bacon's thought about how the world has changed is that he's a bit worried that a lot of the stuff that the ancients had done has been lost. When he describes the New Atlantis, it's of a society that existed before Noah's flood, right? And it's continued and preserved all of the knowledge that was there from before the deluge. And he's worried, I think, about kind of modern deluges. He's worried. I mean, remember, within English recent political history, you'd have had the dissolution of the monasteries. All of the monasteries were seized by the crown and then handed off, and all the libraries and all those manuscripts ended up being dispersed. Right? He's worried about the effects of war, of fire, of all these different things. And I think part of it's not just that you have everyone collectively involved in this endeavor, but if they're also printing and exchanging information, you're going to create a more robust data set, or a more robust data, right? So that if something bad happens, you can at least, there's enough out there that you can rebuild these things.
Interesting. So which is, the subsequent question and the follow-up question that I really had was, how does preservation act as a catalyst for creation?
Well, in a sense, like it's a big part of the deal, because they're motivated by preservation. Like, if you actually read a lot of the reasons for doing this stuff, preservation features a lot more than you'd think. And then almost as a byproduct, creation becomes one of the things that ends up happening. That there's I think science probably ends up advancing at a pace that Bacon would not quite have realized was possible, right?
So therefore, can you explain it with an example of how preservation acts as a catalyst for creation?
Well,
And
if you think,
and in fact, you go out and explain that in how the the old English buildings, where when they went out and started preserving that in your book, right? You talk about how they started ensuring that the old buildings are preserved, so that there's some kind of a history that people can have as the buildings facade started changing, right, at the start of the industrialized era. So again, going back to preservation as a catalyst for creation, because that's something that you normally don't associate with, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, in the sense of, so what you're referring to there in my book is, in the early 20th century, I'll just summarize it for listeners. In the early 20th century, there's a movement to well, so much is being created by the Victorians, that a lot of the older buildings are being torn down, right? The Victorians really didn't care that much about the history a lot of the time. I mean, sometimes they did, but in terms of just a general sense of this is a nice old building from the Middle Ages, they'll be like, can we build something better? Tear it down, build a new thing. They don't worry that much about the historical associations. And so you do get these movements in the late 19th century about let's hold on a second and try to work out what's actually valuable and what's not. And a great deal of work is done in the 1920s, 30s, and even to an extent over the 40s. But obviously, with the war, with the Second World War, there's a kind of puts a pause to a lot of these things to try and preserve ancient buildings. The Society of Arts was behind trying to preserve ancient cottages, that is, normal dwellings that would not have been the sorts of things that would be considered official monuments, like. The earliest stuff to be preserved is stuff like Stonehenge, really ancient monuments where they suddenly think, well, actually, maybe this stuff ought not to just be chipped away by every tourist. We should try to work out, if we preserve these things, we might actually discover more about them. Actually, a great example of this today, of how the concern with preservation can end up being so useful, is... some of your listeners may or may not be aware, there's a big prize right now to read scrolls that were dug up in the 18th century from the volcanic blast at Vesuvius. So I think it's the 1720s. A shepherd discovers, walking around Herculaneum, near Pompeii, the famous Pompeii, that he discovers basically a bunch of scrolls. They try to open them very carefully in the 18th century, but I think the first 2 or 3 scrolls, they just crumble to dust. They're just way too fragile. And so after that, they just preserved all of them. They tried not to touch them at all. And only now, with advances in AI, with advances in particle physics, with advances in all of the technology associated with those things, those can be read, right? So they can digitally unfurl the scrolls without actually having to. They can scan the thing without actually having to break them open. So the preservation there will end up presumably giving us quite a lot of detail once we can read what's inside them, which may be done by the end of the year if the prize is won. There's quite a lot of money up for grabs if any of your listeners are interested. I think by 31st of December. So you're almost we're almost there. There's quite a lot of information up for grabs. And it's interesting that, it's that I think is part of that kind of feedback mechanism, is that sometimes preserving stuff can end up giving us quite a lot more information down the line, which could be of interest. I mean, if it turns out that some of that stuff is lost scrolls from telling us about ancient science and technology, that could be huge, right? There could be vast swathes of things where, it's amazing the extent to which our knowledge of what happened in the past is basically defined by whether or not 1 or 2 books survived or were copied out, or pieces of work managed to kind of withstand the test of time. Even what we have today from what I researched at the time, 16th, 17th century material, there will have been hundreds of copies of books printed, and yet we only have 1 or 2 surviving, and it's based on those 1 or 2, of each book run. It's based on those 1s and 2s that we actually know anything at all sometimes about what was in the contents of those books, or based on the contents of those books, what was going on. And that's the big thing about printing, right? That makes such a big difference. Manuscripts, they're so laborious to copy out. Printing is, again, overwhelmingly seen as a preservation technology. You create 100 copies instead of just 1 copy. That means maybe one of them will in a few hundred years survive, and our knowledge won't just disappear.
Amazing. The other thing is, do you believe that the 18th century industrialization led to the decline of craftsmanship, which is really doing it by hand versus manufacturing by machines? And are we now getting back into an era of craftsmanship? Okay, with the decline of machines, we are getting into an information era, right? So is there a kind of a change that you are seeing?
Well, it depends. In terms of the modern change, it depends what happens with AI, right? It looks like a lot of the craftspeople might be about to lose out their jobs, or not lose their jobs, but I think the tools are changing quite radically. Um, I don't think craftsmanship ever went away completely in many respects. But in terms of the number of craftspeople that you needed for any particular job done, obviously that gets reduced when entire swathes of the industry can be replaced by a few machines. Yes, there's certainly the short answer basically is yes, there is quite a bit of a move to machine-made things or the use of machines rather than doing things by hand. And from a surprisingly early date, right? So a lot of the stuff that would have required craftsmanship in, say, watchmaking and clockmaking, you start to see machines replacing a lot of those things as early as the very early 18th century, maybe even a bit earlier than that. You do start to see things like, even in the late 16th century, there's machinery for polishing armor and weapons and that kind of, again, something you'd have done by hand, and presumably someone, you might not consider it craftsmanship as such, but it's definitely one of the things you'd have had to do as part of what you were doing in the workshop. But a lot of this stuff happens in a way where, it's like saying, a lot of this is like, telling a builder today, would you rather use a drill or would you rather do this by hand? Like, obviously there's a craft in doing this thing by hand, but using a power drill is a bit easier. Like it's potentially a tool. The introduction of power drills is going to result in, there were presumably a few people who would have specialized in drilling technology doing it by hand. If you're going to replace them, then that either frees them up for other aspects of the same job, which they can then specialize in. So it displaces craftsmanship into other areas where it becomes more necessary, I suppose. Or when the industry is structured in such a way that there aren't that many alternative tasks, then I guess it can be a much bigger deal. But the thing to remember about jobs in the 18th, 17th, 18th century is people were paid by the work they did. They weren't paid necessarily, annual or weekly or monthly salaries like they are today. So you were we've got to imagine as most people being basically self-employed. So when you have these new things coming along, these are attractive new tools a lot of the time for them to use. And it's only in a few industries where the introduction of machinery is often a bit like, your competitor down the road has basically got an advantage over you, and then so you might not be quite so happy about that.
Yeah. So I'm taking off from what you were just saying now, that, in the 18th century, a majority of them were self-employed. And now when you go back and look at the next century, it looks like, there are going to be a lot more people who are going to be solopreneurs or self-employed. So that was the reason I was asking this whole question around the rebirth of craftsmanship, but in a new form. Is that the kind of thing that we are seeing? And that's how innovations need to be built. That's really what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, okay, yeah. I mean, in terms of the structure around solopreneurship, I can imagine in lots of industries that is going to be that's going to become the norm. Like, you've got to remember that the way in which we structure employment in terms of you have a job, you earn a wage, and basically no matter what maybe you get a bonus, but no matter what you do most of the time, you're going to get, your annual wage. That only emerges in the 19th century, for the most part, around the fact that you have machinery that is complex enough and large enough that you need to have lots of people managing that machinery. And it means it's not easy to tell how much have you done versus another person, right? It's
Correct.
So if you've got a machine tended by 10 people, how do you split up the output of that machine between those 10 people? Whereas before you'd have just said, make me 10 cloths and I'll pay you for 10 cloths, right? It's exactly
correct.
In that way. So now we're kind of shifting. I think you're right. I suspect, and possibly in a way that's quite long overdue, in the sense of what you'd have expected given what was maybe, the direction of travel. I think kind of wage employment's been quite sticky in a way throughout the 20th century.
Yeah.
Because people like it, right? They like the certainty. They like that kind of smoothing of income in a way that maybe now with things like greater access to credit it becomes easier for people to smooth their income and smooth their expenditure using kind of financial instruments. It kind
Absolutely,
of
and
makes it.
and that's really where I believe that some of the the way people were employed, the way people were paid, we still are living in an industrial era,
Hmm.
right? But the era of today is completely changing, but yet those practices have not changed, right?
Yeah.
And that's really where I think we are in a transitionary phase, if I were to call it. And would you agree
Hmm.
with me on that?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's exactly right. Yeah.
And one thing that I wanted to talk to you was when you're tracking this innovation and inventions, uh, how did it shift from the British era to the American era, right? Because
Hmm.
obviously, there's a significant shift in the late 1800s to the 1900s, where innovation, the center of the universe really was the British, right,
Hmm.
Empire. And then, with so much of action happening in the 16th, 17th, and the 18th century, so many things get invented, and
Hmm.
then the shift happens to the US. And have you kind of studied that, and have you looked at how did that shift happen in spite of so much of melting pot of thinking happening in the British Empire?
Yeah, it's a great question. I have a sense of how it happens, but I'm not like totally sure. So I'll tell you what my kind of hunch is, if you like. Is certainly over the course of, I would say, the early 19th century, the center of gravity starts to dissipate. In fact, let's go back even further. At first, and let's zoom in beyond country level. At first, in the late 16th century, it's almost entirely happening in London. So in a particular quite small city in 1550s, about 50,000 people, right? Pretty tiny. That grows very rapidly to about 200,000 people in 1600, 575,000 people in 1700. So massive change. London is very much, I think, the centre of activity in terms of inventive activity for that very early period. After 1700, it starts to spread out of London. So it spreads into other parts. Where would it spread most naturally? Probably the same country, right? People speak the same language. They're moving around the same country pretty easily. So you start to see places like Birmingham. You start to see places like around uh, the kind of Welsh borders region, around
Mm,
Shropshire,
mm,
in the Midlands. So the places are in and around Birmingham, in Lancashire, in the northwest, so in and around Manchester and Liverpool, in the southwest around Bristol, in the north around northeast around Newcastle, even the northwestern extent, so very distant Cumbria, where there's not that many people. Start to see quite a lot of inventive activity taking place as well, and of course in Scotland, particularly in the belt between Glasgow and Edinburgh. So you start to see this kind of shift of not just industrial activity, but inventive activity outside of this particular city. And then from those cities, it starts to shift outwards again as well, right? Because
mm,
a lot of the industrial activity that's taking place is going to start moving to where it's most efficient to do those things. And
mm.
especially as you get more developed areas, in the sense of they get higher and higher wages, it gets harder and harder. As we see even today, manufacturing starts searching for the cheapest people to employ. Right? It doesn't want to
Correct.
spend that much money if it can. Cheaper resources, lower wages to pay. So you start to see that movement already out of London as a lot of these industries start searching for the lowest costs, or at least the best kind of better infrastructure and so on as well. And with that, you also get a lot of infrastructure building in Britain that makes more and more parts of the British economy more and more integrated as well. Canal building, railway building later on, road improvement, which is often not as noticed. River navigation, so taking existing rivers,
Mm,
making them navigable by boat, so that you can improve connections between different towns and cities. A lot of that is spurred on by this as people start to think, how can I connect this all up, not only to London, but to these newer centres as they're springing up? And then from there, it starts to move even further outwards. So that's when you start to see a lot of artisans, a lot of manufacturers, a lot of inventors emigrating to what becomes the United States. You see a lot of them, even very early on, moving to France. It's as early as the 1710s, end of the 1710s, that Britain bans the emigration of skilled artisans in various different industries, where it already has a bit of a technological lead, particularly iron, particularly watchmaking, particularly tool making. They're worried because the French are, they're sending basically spies, industrial spies, to Britain to round up as many workers as they can with these skills and bring them over to France. Right, so that's pretty early, right? 1710s. Already it suggests the French are interested. The Russians are sending apprentices over as well, and that's pretty distant too, to learn in British factories and then hopefully bring that stuff back. And the Russians manage it very badly because they bring back these apprentices and then they completely get ignored, or they stop paying them. I mean, they just totally fail to learn a lot of these skills. And it's a much bigger language gap as well. And just bigger distances, and also it's just harder. The greater the distance, the harder it gets. But you do start already to see this diffusion into the rest of Europe of a lot of that invention, that kind of push for improvement. And I think there are kind of other locations which already have kind of lots of groups of inventors. Like even early on, Britain itself, London benefits from the Dutch revolt. There's a mass movement of people from what is today Belgium, which is a very rich part of the country, to the Netherlands, but also into Britain. You also likewise, during the Reformation, a lot of Italian Protestants, they don't want to be in Southern Europe with the Inquisition. So a lot of talented people leave to Northern Europe. They come to Britain as well. So this is a very old story of inventors going wherever they're going to have the best critical mass. But London for a long time is like the Silicon Valley of the 16th, 17th centuries. It is one of the lodestones that's attracting everyone. And then that spreads out. And then, I mean, you continue to see this, right? Like, think of, I mean, in India, you've got Tata, right? Tata, I think he went and trained in Britain for a long time. And then came back and brought a lot of the technology with him. I know that there's a Jamaican version of Tata, like another guy who came to Britain, was like, we don't have any of this back home. Let's start a factory. Let's bring all this stuff over and start, there's no reason we couldn't do this at home. And they think this is a great idea. You see the same with a lot of Japanese engineers were sent to Germany, to Britain, to France, to America in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. They came back, not just bringing skills, but bringing that kind of, the improving mentality almost kind of gets like, redone in kind of new cultural social contexts, right? In terms of the kinds of movements that they have, the kinds of ways that they interpret it. And so, yeah, for much of the 19th century, it's the story first of the spread to Europe and the Americas, but also already starting, I think, to go even further afield as well. Okay. And that's the story, I think, of the last few hundred years, is it's just continued to spread. I mean, today, invention, I think, is pretty global. We've reached a stage where different industries can be super high-tech in a particular country, which you'll not find in any other country, because most cities are massive, but they also have these critical masses of people doing amazing things.
So do you believe, we are at a stage where the center of gravity of the Silicon Valley, so you're saying the 16th, 17th century was London, the 1900s were the Silicon Valley, the American continent, and when you look back and now, and see, okay, for the next 100 years, would you see the center of gravity shifting? Because I think civilizations keep shifting, and do you see a center of gravity shift happening?
I think it's still America.
Okay.
I think if you'd asked me 10 years ago, I'd have said maybe China, maybe somewhere in India. But I think still America, right? It looked for a while like it was China, but I think I mean, again, just look at the migration flows, right? It tells you where everyone's going, right? The moment people can move to America to go to Silicon Valley, or to, it could be Miami or Austin, Texas, or somewhere like that. America seems to keep creating the conditions that makes it attractive, right? But remember, they've got a big advantage already because they are already the place to be. It's hard to overcome that advantage.
Correct.
London, I think, gets overcome partly out of bad luck. Partly, I think, because of kind of the opportunities that America could already offer from the get-go. But also, I mean, the First World War probably has a big impact. You know, Britain goes from being, in 1914, Britain is the equivalent today of China for being the manufacturer of the world, Saudi Arabia for being the main energy source of the world, because it's nearly all the world's coal is being produced still in Britain, and New York because it's the financial center of the world in 1914. By 1918, but by 1918, this has changed, right? Like the First World War radically changes it, and Britain becomes a debtor to the United States. So the center of gravity, I think, is officially shifted by the First World War. But I think you can already see that America's trajectory is very kind of rapidly changing and overtaking by around 1900, 1910. You see that in GDP per capita statistics, but I think in a way those are a bit misleading. Like in terms of just center of activity, it definitely shifts in that period. So for it to shift again, I think you'd need America to somehow kind of fumble the ball, you know, just like drop the ball in some way. But look at its energy prices. They're really kind of going all out in terms of creating the infrastructure. They've got plentiful natural gas. They're probably going to still create a lot of nuclear power. They're going to have all of the stuff for cheap energy, which is essential to industry. But not just industry, but like to anyone just living, right? You need energy to do all of these things. They've got so much money going into research and development to the extent that we still rely on basically American pharmaceutical companies to produce all of our drugs in terms of inventing new ones and curing new diseases. And again, the migration flows. And I think China looked like it could be a contender until the last few years, really, when it was like, you know, people suddenly having their doubts about what the state might or might not want to do, seemingly not prioritizing the economy anymore, prioritizing global geostrategic things or their COVID response. All these kinds of things made it seem like it wasn't going to become the new place where things would be done. But who knows? I mean, this is just my conjecture.
Yeah, no. I think it's a very, very beautiful point that you make, and but at the same time, when you look at the 18th century inventions, which is the steam engine, the power loom, completely changed some of the industry, production capacities, kind of a thing. And then when you go back to the 1900s and the early 1900s, you look at the automotive completely changing the economy. You look at chips changing the computerization. But when you look back today, those kinds of innovations seem to actually not happening, right? Say, for example, like how trains change the way you travel. You had the aeroplanes taking you to different countries, and now when you look back, it looks almost like incremental innovations are happening or incremental improvements are happening, but no serious invention that can change the way you are looking at. Is that the state that you see?
No, I think just because I think all of it's incremental. I think all invention is incremental, but some increments have bigger impacts than others in a way that's very surprising, right? It's like you take something, a new technology, you improve it 5%, 5%, 5%, 5%, and then often you'll hit that threshold where suddenly that thing is profitable in a way that it wasn't. Suddenly that thing, I don't know, you improve the advertising by 5%. Suddenly you reach the mass market versus the niche market. You know, it's always those little 5%. So I think there's always that tiny little inch forward, you know, that with our toes inching forward, we finally go over the precipice. and then a whole new reality is kind of shaped by it. All inventions, I think, are like that, because when you look at detail at all inventions, you start to notice that there's this very long chain of events. And even particular inventions or patents, when you look at the detail, you're like, oh, this took 10 years of margin improvement by one person in their shed, tinkering away until it was ready. So like that's another kind of aspect in which those things happen. But in terms of, I guess I can see there being transformative inventions that may change the location of activity, but it just looks like it's still going to be in America in terms of, like, they want to be first still, right? They do all of their policies around still being ahead on AI, for example, having all of the chips set up, having enough computational power for artificial intelligence, trying to sort out their infrastructure so that it's appropriate. All of those things, I think, make a big difference, and make it. It's not as though other countries aren't trying to catch up; they are. But in terms of keeping ahead, like if you want it, then you have to it's like every generation of improvers has to do that.
So one other thing that I found very interesting when I was reading your articles and the book was patenting for public good versus patenting for private goods, right? And it has an implication on how society, innovates, and just because it is publicly available, you then innovate on top of it, right? So therefore, some of these economies or some of these countries which patented for public good, you see a massive movement in terms of the curve of innovation, right? And so is that very, very critical if you want the center of gravity to move? Patenting for, and America seems to be really patenting for private good, okay? And largely around saying, okay, let me, if you look at the amount of patents Google is buying, or many of these companies are buying, it's almost like saying, let me own everything. And what I find is, when you patent for public good, the amount of people who come in and develop on top of that public good is fairly large, and therefore innovation tends to move up. Is that something that you've seen in how nations get built and how empires get built?
I think there's a balance, right? So I think over the course of my career, I've kind of gone from being mildly anti-patent to being in the middle. And the reason for that is, I think there are two things at play. One is information. You do need more information. You need information to be out there. So the origin of patents is about, well, back in the 16th, 17th century, a lot of invention is very tied up in particular people's expertise. And even today, it's very, very difficult to copy someone's invention without having the person who's worked on it, right? Even today, there's a reason that tech companies have non-compete clauses, right? So you fire someone or someone leaves, it's like, no, you're not allowed to work for our competitors for at least 5 to 10 years or whatever, right? There's a reason for that, which is that those people's skills are very valuable. It makes it much, much, much easier to copy technology if you yourself have worked on it. And it's a reason why one of the best ways to copy stuff is send people to go and work on it, bring them back, and then they'll know what to do. Right? It's all like, you can send as many blueprints as you want, but it's going to still be very difficult to reverse engineer that. Or there'll be little hidden knacks or the kind of things that aren't shown on the plans. It hasn't been translated quite properly. There'll be, you work out ways of making these things work. So a big part of patents was about giving individuals a monopoly on a new invention so that they would come to the country. So early patents are almost like immigration visas, right? It's like, you come to the country, you get the privilege on the new thing that you're bringing to the country. That way we've got you in the country and you're creating stuff for us and not for other people. And then often you have terms in the patent that say things like, you need to train a few locals into how to do the thing that you've brought. Right? So there are conditions on these monopolies that you're giving them. And again, even just a temporary monopoly, but the very early ones, they're modeled on the Venetian patent system, which is about 10 years, so multiples of 10. But very quickly in Britain or in England, what you start to see is ones in multiples of 7. And 7 years is the duration of an apprenticeship. So if you have it that's one for 21 years, that means you're thought to be able to create 3 generations of apprentices who are going to know this stuff. And at the end of it, once they've passed that period, they're going to be able to take this industry further, and it's going to be rooted in the country, right? So if you die or you emigrate or you leave again, at least the industry will be able to stay, and kind of creates that permanence. Later in the 18th century, you start to see the growth of what we now call patent specifications, right? So as a condition for patenting, one of the things you have to do is you have to send in the blueprints. You have to say, this is how it's done. Give us a big description that people could reasonably copy, right? So by reading it, they should be able to kind of get someone who's relatively expert should be able to work out what you're doing and copy the thing. And that's, again, very important, because what you're doing is you're incentivizing people to reveal information that they might otherwise have kept secret. What does that do? It creates a permanent base. Like, again, it's like data preservation, right? It's that if someone keeps their technology a secret, they die, it's gone. And there's loads of examples of that. So like 14th century China, the Ming Dynasty, there's a whole bunch of there's a kind of a particular technique in pottery that's just lost. Right, the guy dies. Okay. All of his apprentices presumably also either failed to learn, or they died, or they got distracted, did something else. And it's only rediscovered later. And the story is it's rediscovered because a guy had a dream in which the dead potter who the secret had died with appeared to him in a dream and explained how to do it. Like, that's the story, right? Make of that what you will. But that's a real worry, right? So you want to have a system in place where people are at least almost kind of, think of it this way: you could pay someone a prize, like the Society of Arts did, which is one of the interesting things it did was pay people money to reveal their secret. Correct. But then you need to collect money. You need to get capital together to do that, to pay them for their secrets. Or you can say, I'll give you a monopoly. That's free in terms of getting the money up front for it, right? They may or may not fail. They may exploit the patent. They may not exploit the patent, but at least they write down the secret, right? So for basically doing it on the cheap, again, without having to front the money, you can get people to reveal their secrets. So I think there is a usefulness to patents in that respect. At least that's the way in which it's kind of evolved. And nowadays, a lot of it is about a patent can be kind of rendered invalid if it doesn't seem to be descriptive enough. That's also the way the case law in the late 18th century evolves as well. So I think you do need to have some kind of protection. In a way, it's a cheap way of doing these things. And the other aspect here, so one is about information. The second one, though, is about, I think there's an underlying principle in a lot of policy, which is that you get what you pay for. Yeah, you need to put some resources into something to get something out of it, right? Now, it's not necessarily the fact that if you put the money down, you're always going to get results. A lot of the time, you're going to pay for a dud. But if you're not paying for something, if you're not putting resources into something, you can't expect to get the outcome at all, right? Like, so if you never invest in pharmaceutical R&D, you're never going to get new drugs. You're just not going to do it. So you do need to have systems in place that at least allow for capital to be deployed to pursue particular R&D routes. And so, like, this is the really interesting thing about pharmaceuticals, right? People always talk about big pharma and like, they spend billions and billions to create one tiny drug that barely changes things by 5% on some particular thing. And then it's super expensive for everybody to buy. And it's like, okay, well, part of the cost is from the way you've regulated it. But also, if you're going to do that, if you want to regulate it that way, you need to get the £1 billion. Like, you need to get that money to actually pay for any of it. And so you need some kind of system in place in which you get that. So I do think where the balance is not pro-patents, anti-patents. It's about how long are the durations of the patents. For how many years are you keeping things protected? How strong are the monopolies? I mean, you mentioned companies buying up lots of patents at once, so patent thickets, as I think they're often called. Like, yes, you maybe need to look at that and make sure people aren't just kind of chopping up lots of things and protecting it and kind of preventing change that way. But if what they're doing is they're revealing loads of information about what they're doing, just by acting defensively, then that means the moment the patent expires, it's going to be great. We're going to have a whole load of stuff. So the counterfactual is if you're not going to use that system, you need some kind of alternative that pays for secrets to be revealed, that pays for information to be revealed. That could be prizes. It could be like the Society of Arts, where you pool subscription funds and they pay for these things. But it seems to work pretty well on the whole.
Okay. But what about public goods? Say, for example, today, if you look at the issue that big tech is facing, you got those 4 companies or 5 companies dominating every aspect of business. And if you have a public good, then the distribution and the democratization of innovation can be far more widespread. So is that a problem?
But the public good, I think, is the revealing of information, right? So as long as the system still allows for the information, the secrets to be revealed, that is, I think, the public good, right? Because if you just reveal information, you need to get something in return. Otherwise, you're just not going to bother doing it. You just keep it secret to yourself. You need to have a system in place and that's the public kind of cost if we don't have something in place to do that. In terms of the consolidation of power within a few companies, within certain sectors they have a lot of power. To be honest, though, it still looks pretty competitive to me. Like, just because you have as long as you don't have one, and you still have at least a few. The fact that they see the need to buy all the patents tells them that they're worried about outsiders coming in and swooping in with new technology, right? Or the fact that they keep having to buy competitors when they're growing, being like, oh, we need to spend a few billion to acquire this competitor. That actually, to me, that shows the system's working. Because that, to me, tells me there aren't things in the way that are preventing competitors emerging at all. Right, so as long as they're having to play defensively, I think that's fine. The moment they're not doing that, that's when I'm going to be worried, right?
Great. How important do you think is for innovation and ideas where you have to operate at the edge of different disciplines?
What do you mean? Give a more.
Say, for example, biology and technology, or therefore you got biochemistry, right? Or for example, biotechnology, where I think these are at the edges of different subjects, and that's where a lot of innovation and invention happen, right? So do you think those are very important for inventions to spread? For example, you're talking about neuroscience, right? So for example, it's neuroscience is again at the edges of 2 different subjects, right? So therefore what we see as innovation today is you bring in 2 diverse fields and then start to kind of look at them, and then a new invention or an innovation happens.
I think that is the way a lot of it occurs. Not always, though. I think often you still get a lot of invention that's within a kind of old sector, and you still see new ways of doing things all the time. And there is a risk sometimes that if we always categorize innovation as being at the edges, that we actually neglect the kind of not basic, but like stuff that's in older fields, more mature fields. Specialisms that have been around for decades or hundreds of years, a lot of those things still see quite significant improvements. Just look at across the world today, right? You will see very different sectors in very different countries. That tells you that within the countries that don't have the technology of another country, that's clearly it's not like these things just automatically go to the best thing, the most optimized thing. So you see those differences already, but I think even at the cutting edge, you can often see that. People are still, shoes. We've been making shoes for how many years? Millennia, right? And yet we still see innovation in new shoes, better soles, things that are better for your knees, better for runners. I mean, people running marathons are still inventing new shoes. Bicycles are the same. They're a bit younger as a technology. They've been around for only a few hundred years, but you know, people were still not that long ago winning races because they had redesigned the bike. Right, they figured out the way to optimize everything 5%, 5%, 5%, 5% until you get something that seems so transformatively different that you're getting completely different results. So I don't think it always has to be at the cutting edge of new fields. The other interesting thing that I think does go on, though, is you get quite a big degree of... The world is very specialized, right, and always has been very specialized. You spend many years kind of gaining a skill in a very particular niche. You maybe work in that niche for a few years, and then basically the only thing you know is in that niche. And when you get the combinations, you're actually creating new niches, right? Because you've got specialist biologists, you've got specialist chemists, and then you need to have specialist biochemists, right, who are combining the two. They become their own subfield. And again, they have a very specialized language. They have jargon that they use. They refer to things in a very particular way, which, you know, if we have a conversation with a biochemist, we're not going to understand half of the words because it's like very specific things that only they know and only their kind of colleagues and other friends in that area will know. And that's always been the case, I think. Like if you were an artisan in the year 1400, you're going to have your own very specialized lingo that no one else is going to understand as well. Like those specialisms have disappeared maybe, or they're even more niche than they are today. But we have lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of specialisms, and they're continuing to multiply. But to my mind, what that means is that the scope for more invention is only growing, right? So every time you have a new subfield, that thing can then be improved incrementally. And every time you birth a new kind of combination, that just increases the surface area of things that can be improved, right? So, I mean, this speaks to kind of, you often hear people, you know, worrying about the end of invention, you know, have all the low-hanging fruit being plucked. Nonsense, I think. I mean, I think, if anything, we're still kind of discovering just how much we don't know. Because by expanding the sphere of what we do know, we discover even more surface area of things that we can then do next.
Okay. So one of the things that, I want to ask you is, in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, you had the Royal Society of Arts, Commerce, and, manufactures, as it was called, being the hub of inventions and encouraging invention, right? Do you see similar organizations in countries like the US, India, Japan, where they encourage this kind of thinking because it happened as a melting pot in a organization like the Royal Society of Arts? So, do you see similar outfits in these countries?
It's a great question. So, to explain to your listeners, the Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce, nice snappy title, founded in 1754, is unusual because it's a subscription-funded kind of one member, one vote kind of organization where they pool the subscription funds, the membership fees, into a pot, and then using that pot, they then pay for things to do projects. In the first 100 years, that involves paying prizes for new inventions if they're not patented already. Again, so that they kind of cover the stuff that isn't already being covered by the patent system. So wherever the patent system isn't very good at encouraging invention, they are hopefully filling in the gaps. So I see patents and prizes as being kind of complementary, right, rather than competing here. So that's what they were doing. And then they kind of shift on to other different ways of encouraging invention, like using exhibitions, and then later on, all sorts of other ways too. But that's the kind of organization it is. And I think it's still very unusual. It's a voluntary organization. It's deploying capital. it's very democratic because it's one person, one vote for that first 100 years. Before later they have a committee, which is representative. Today, it's more like structured just like a normal charity with only a few differences. It's a very unusual organisation. Even the RSA today, it gets the Royal much later in 1908, but even the RSA today doesn't look anything like the original RSA in terms of the way it's structured. And the closest thing I can think to it are you do occasionally in kind of crypto circles, you see DAOs, these distributed autonomous organizations. That's the closest thing I've seen where DAOs are maybe used for funding new science or funding invention. That's the closest thing I've seen to it in terms of the way that it's structured.
What do you think of VCs or crowdfunding? Is it very similar, but you may not be doing it within the scope of, say, a organization like RSA?
Yeah, so crowdfunding is not far off. You did have crowdfunding in the 18th century as well, though. So most books were crowdfunded. Not most books, but lots of books were crowdfunded. If you look at a lot of books from the 18th century, there will be a list of subscribers, right? If you go to the back pages or front pages, there'll be a huge list of subscribers. These are the people who paid to get the book published. Because it's a very costly endeavor, very capital intensive thing to do. So you had crowdfunding, but crowdfunding I think of as being more per specific project. Venture capital, I suppose, is different because it's for profit, right? You're doing something where you're expecting to get a return. Whereas one of the key things about the Society of Arts was that it was a charitable organization. So there's nothing expected from the members in terms of them receiving returns. There are earlier attempts in the 1720s to structure the same project as a profit-making institution, though. So it is kind of an evolution from this idea of the business corporation. In a way, the modern business corporation, is itself very similar to the way VC is today structured, right? Because the very earliest business corporations were for very, very high-risk ventures, where they would maybe have a patent monopoly on the new discovery based on whatever they would get. But the very early ones are for things like voyages of exploration into completely new trading areas where no one's ever been from your country before. So in search of a northeast passage to Japan and China, but instead they find Russia. In search of a northwest passage, again, to Japan and China, because everyone wants to trade with Japan and China, but they instead discover Canada. They're trying it that way. Or, later on, the East India Company in 1600, or 1599/1600. Again, trying to find a trade route, copy the Portuguese, see if they can work out how the Portuguese have gone around the Cape of Good Hope, access to new markets. Obviously, later the East India Company becomes more like a state, but that's a much, much later development, right? For the early years, it's much more like it's a company. But also at the same time for things like mining, because you sink a mine. Let's say you put loads and loads of money, paying lots and lots of people to dig a hole down in the ground, and you find nothing, right? It's like VC, right? You spend lots and lots of capital. You organize all these investors, or the same with the voyages of discovery. You send out a ship. You hope that in a few years' time it comes back. Who knows? Maybe it comes back full of spices because you found India. Maybe it comes back with polar bears or something because you found nothing. It's like...
Yeah, true. No, I think that's the reason why I was asking, are there, the forms that it has taken, is different. So I have a final question for you. What's the perils of being a public historian?
Oh, you're referencing one of my latest pieces here. What are the perils of being a public historian? So the way to put this is that when you put research out, when you put your work out into the public, and as an audience grows, you do get what happens is, if you care about these things, you find yourself getting quite worried about accidentally telling people the wrong thing, right? Accidentally You've heard a story. We do this all the time, right? We'll hear a story. We'll be like, that's a great fact. I'm going to tell all my friends the next time something relevant kind of comes up. You tell a small group of people at a party this new fact that you've learned. And then 10 days later, you read something saying, actually, this fact is completely rubbish. It's been debunked. And you feel a little bit embarrassed. You probably don't go out of your way to correct it by emailing all your friends and being like, by the way, ignore what I said. But you're a bit like, oh, I can't believe that happened. But as your audience grows, this becomes a bigger and bigger deal where, I've got about 26,000 subscribers on my email list. If I accidentally tell them the wrong thing, then I'm going to feel pretty guilty about it. So it comes with, I think, a responsibility to really fact check a lot. One of the great things about podcasts, actually, and doing stuff like this is I can make loads of mistakes and people will be like, oh, he's kind of just not really remembering, But when it's written down, I think you've got to be much more careful. No one's going to reference or cite a podcast. Lots of people are going to cite something that's written, I think. Or, they might hear it on a podcast and then go and double check for themselves. It's much more likely to happen that way. So it's a more relaxed medium in a way. But when you're writing stuff for the public, the larger the audience, the greater the responsibility to not only prevent yourself putting out misinformation, but I also find myself getting very worried about my own sources. Like, where am I learning stuff from? I can't go and check everything I read. I have, there's not enough time in the day to go and check absolutely everything you read. So there is a lot of trust involved in the way that we share information, the way that we share knowledge, right? And so I am very concerned with the institutions of trust giving, right? So academic journals, academic societies, what they often do is they deploy trust. They give a stamp of approval saying experts have checked this, so you can, instead of taking it with a rock of salt, you can only take it with a pinch of salt now. Or you can maybe a grain of salt, right?
Yeah.
I'm not saying you should trust it completely, but actually that's what ends up happening is a lot of people they'll say, oh, it was in an academic journal, trust it completely. I think the public needs to be a little bit more careful about that, but it shouldn't go too far. It shouldn't be like, I don't trust anything. It's all a lie. It's all a huge conspiracy, right? I think there's such a thing as too far. But I get very concerned that, the well I'm drawing from, right? The water that I'm getting of information, I want to make sure it's not corrupted. I want to make sure this stuff is fresh. This stuff is healthy. This stuff is good, right?
Okay.
And I had a sort of experience that your readers can go, or your listeners can go and read up all about it, because I think it's a bit too long to explain. But I had an experience where I tried to correct something that I'd seen, misinformation being put out there. And the reaction from the institutions was not the way that you would expect. Like, I kind of expect the institutions to self-correct. But also, if you see misinformation out there that's being spread quite a lot, and because of your own expertise, because of your own knowledge, that it is something that's wrong, I do think it would be healthier if people took the attitude of putting their foot down and saying, no, that's wrong. Right? I don't mean everyone should just, this is not like a manifesto for internet trolls to say, you see something, tell them it's wrong. No, it's if you have the expertise, if you know because of, your expertise that something is wrong, I think there is somewhat of a duty to kind of point that out. And I think in healthy public debate, you see that. But that's kind of what I expect to happen. So I think there are responsibilities that come with that. But there are also just in general, there's just risks. I mean, when you put stuff out there, the wider the audience, the more people you're going to find who know you're wrong. But also you're going to come across people who are, I think I put them as mad, bad, and sad. Like people who just hate whatever you're saying for whatever reason. Yeah. And it sucks, but that's what you're going to get. And that's just, I think that is just what happens when you talk to a group of any size, is that, I mean, it's like, have you ever seen polling done on any question where it's like, I don't know, if you polled the population of a country, do you think killing puppies is bad? Like, you're going to get 99, 98% saying it's obviously bad. Who are these 2%? There's always going to be the 2%, right? Who are always going to say, no, yeah, it's good, right?
Yeah.
But like the larger the audience, the more likely you are to find that 2%, and they're going to cause trouble of some kind.
So, so I'm going to wrap up with a set of rapid fire questions for you.
Okay.
And the first question that I have is, what would be your advice to the inventors of today, and what do you think they should pursue, and how do you think they should work towards breakthrough inventions?
Focus on the marginal. I'd say focus on the incremental, focus on the marginal. Don't get distracted by the big picture. Getting that marginal thing and actually getting it done. It's amazing how many of the big breakthroughs are just from focusing on the kind of minutiae there.
Fantastic. What does success mean to you?
Oh, I don't know. You've completely stumped me there. What does success mean to me? I think that's up to people themselves. They have their own value systems.
Okay.
But it's good not to get distracted by. It's good to think about try to work out whether or not you're using proxy measures or whether or not they're actually your values, right? So I don't know, getting more subscribers on your Twitter or X or whatever is maybe just a proxy for influence. It's not actually influence, right?
Okay.
If that's your aim.
Yeah. Uh, do you think a public historian uh, has a foundation built for becoming a futurist?
Becoming a futurist. Not necessarily. A lot of public history is maybe not that future looking at all. So not necessarily. I don't think so. But it could in some. I mean, the more you study history, the more patterns you learn, or the more patterns you notice about the way the world works and has potentially always worked, or the differences you see in the way things can change, which can be very dramatic and surprising. Yeah, I guess it may give you some senses of being a futurist or some skills to bring to the table, maybe.
Okay, fantastic. What's one piece of advice that you will never, forget, which you carry on in your work even today?
Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So, which is
Brilliant. Brilliant.
ironically, the anti-inventors manifesto or a bit of advice, because they're constant optimizers and perfectionists. But there is a point at which you need to stop optimizing and just, as they say in tech, ship. You've got to put it out there at some point.
What would be your advice to a 18-year-old in a university today?
In a university, my advice would be check that the career you want is actually one that requires a higher education. And I'm not saying don't do a higher education, but a lot of people get distracted from jobs they would find very personally satisfying, but which are often seen as like beneath them. What used to be called blue collar jobs and so on. A lot of those can be very, very satisfying for a lot of people. And I think there's a lot of social pressure to push you into white collar, inverted commas, jobs because of going to university. And that's not necessarily actually a recipe for happiness. Like I don't know. Sometimes I look jealously at people who become electricians and plumbers. They earn a lot of money sometimes, and they have very happy lives. So in terms of just covering the basics for flourishing, sometimes it can be achieved in that way.
Okay, brilliant. Uh, if you were to invite two or three people for your dream dinner, who would you like to be on the table? And what
Alive
would
or
you ask
dead?
them and why?
Alive or dead?
It can be alive or dead.
Oh my goodness. Okay, if it's dead, then we get loads.
Yeah.
Wait, so dinner party, 2 or 3 people. Oh, Genghis Khan, Just an extraordinary story. Love to know what happened. This is a guy who starts in his 40s from basically nothing and then ends up conquering half the world. So this is quite an interesting guy. Awful guy as well, but I'm interested. If I'm at the dinner party, might as well. I get the one shot chance, right? So you were asking about how to get success. I don't think there's any more people in terms of the thing he chose, which was very awful for millions of people. He was very effective. So I'd be interested. And was it 2 or 3 people? It's going to be a bunch of inventors. It's going to be. Okay. I want to talk to James Watt, who does the separate condenser for steam engines. I'd love to know more about just what's going on at the time. Just almost get his memoirs, if anything, on all his stories. And someone like Samuel Hartlib, who's a guy, he's known as a sort of intelligencer. This is a guy who's at the heart of all the stuff happening in the mid-17th century in England, where he's the guy who's exchanging all the letters with people. And so he knows everything that's going on. Okay. And I have a few specific questions for him about what he's written in the stuff that we've got. So some of it's for my research interest, but some of it's also kind of general interest too.
The last question that I have is, what is one thing that you believe in that people around you don't agree with you?
That I believe that people don't agree with. I think it's something I touched on very briefly before, which is the scope for further invention. I think I have a pretty strong belief that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, and most people, even around me, don't think that, right? They believe that invention is getting harder, it's getting more difficult to make new advances. And I don't think there's anything innate about the way that that's the case.
Thanks, Anton. It was lovely talking to you. You took us back in history. You took me back personally to different people who have done phenomenal work, and the transition and the transformation that they did in their period is something to learn, to understand, and there's so much to kind of use it in today's invention and the work that we do. Thanks a lot. It was a learning and a brilliant session, and thanks for this conversation.
Thanks very much for having me. Thank you. I enjoyed it too. Thanks.